So we have hit a part of this course where we're really going to be focusing on virtualization. That's right. For the next concrete example of when we might use a technology like virtual device contexts, and think about if we were doing some kind of a migration from one data center in an organization maybe to another type of data center design. You could literally set up a dual core in your core infrastructure, and you could be running both for a while, right? Let me draw this out. So let's say in the core, we have three physical Nexus 7000s. What we do is have. And we're talking about 5.x Nexus operating system code. Please keep that in mind. When we go through these nuggets, I am speaking to you about limitations that exist at 5.x code. If you're watching this years in the future, the Nexus 7K may be capable of many more virtual device contexts, right? So we just got to keep in mind that when we talk about these parameters, we are speaking at the moment. So at the moment, 4 virtual device contexts, and one of those is called VDC1. This is the default virtual device context. It is what we use when we first start configuring the Nexus 7K. We can't delete it. And obviously, VDC1 is really, really important because it's going to control our shared resources. It'll manage things like the allocation of ports to the other non-default virtual device contexts that we can create. It'll handle system-wide things like network time protocol and licensing configurations that we're going to make on the device overall as a whole. Now, you want a really good recommendation for VDC1? Why don't you restrict it to all of your management stuff, right? Go ahead and use it for management, and then when you create your other virtual device contexts, let's say A, B, and C, those would be for the actual movement of data center traffic. So when you decide to call upon virtual device contexts, go ahead and use VDC1 strictly for management type purposes. That's generally a best practice recommendation. Something else that I want you to keep in mind here is the fact that VLANs and virtual routing and forwarding tables, those are all going to be on a per virtual device context basis. Think about that. Think about the scalability. So we can have VLAN 100 in our VDCA, we can have VLAN 100 in B, and VLAN 100 in C. Even though these IDs are the same, because they're in different virtual device contexts, they will indeed be separate and distinct VLANs. Now, another concept that I want to drive home to here about our virtual device contexts is the sense that they are indeed separate fault domains, aren't they? Yeah, think about virtual device context A, one we create, and virtual device context B that we also create. If we have a BGP process in here, and we have a BGP process in here, and this one is corrupted and literally fails, it should not affect the BGP process running in virtual device context A. So really, we have an amazing separation of processes here. Just to further drive this point home, realize that when it comes to debug and show commands for the verifications, yeah, sure enough, they are going to be showing completely separate details depending on which virtual device contexts we are in. Now let's zero in on interface allocation. And by the way, I probably should have warned you when we started this nugget that I'm going to go much, much deeper than the certification environment because I think these virtual device contexts, if you're going to need them, are pretty darn important. Now, what would happen if you went and you wanted to create a virtual interface in one of your contexts? Sure enough, you would have to be in that context in order to create the virtual interface. So we know we are going to handle physical interface allocations from our virtual device context 1, that important default virtual device context. But remember, you need to go into your user created context in order to create a virtual interface. Now, a lot of the I/O modules that you can insert into your Nexus 7000 series can have their individual ports assigned to the appropriate virtual device contexts. But please, I need you to be aware of the fact that some modules you can't do that with. You have to assign literally groupings of ports to a particular virtual device context as a group. Okay, is that clear? So on certain I/O modules, you have free reign. You can do whatever you want with the ports as far as VDC assignment. But with certain other modules, and you'd have to read the documentation to be sure, you can only assign grouping of ports into the different virtual device contexts. So be very, very careful to read the appropriate documentation for your module when you get ready to assign its interfaces to particular VDCs. Now think about your role-based access control. You know that when you go into the default virtual device context, you've got the network admin and you've got the network operator pre-created roles. Well, sure enough, in a user created context, you would have a VDC admin and a VDC operator. Now, of course, for your abilities to manage the device, if you're a network admin and you go into a user created context, you'll inherit the role of VDC admin. Just like if you were a network operator in VDC1 and you go into a particular user created context, you'll inherit the appropriate rights in that virtual device context. Now remember, the VDC admin in one particular context, user created, would be protected from going into another user created context and wreaking havoc. Now, by the way, our focus here at this level is obviously not configuration, as you know. But I do want you to realize just how easy it is for a virtual device context to be created. You go into VDC1 as a network admin, and in the default virtual device context, in global configuration mode, you say VDC, and let's make one called test. Yeah, it is literally that easy to create a virtual device context. By the way, that would work if you have the Advanced Services license. Now, you may say, well, Anthony, I don't want to spend the money for the Advanced Services license. I want to experiment with this for free. And remember, you do have a 120-day grace period in which you could experiment with virtual device contexts. Now, we create the test VDC easy enough, but how would you get in there? How would you move into that virtual device context? Well, we have a command for that, and it's the switch to command. So you would say switch to VDC test, and you would enter that virtual device context. And then we actually have a fun command of switch back in order to jump our VDC1, our default VDC, and then here you can see our two virtual device contexts that we created, one called payroll and one called my VDC. Yeah, I know, silly names. Now, another command that I want you to be familiar with is show VDC membership. Look what this is doing for us. It's showing us when we issue it in the default VDC, it's showing us all of those interfaces in the default virtual device context, and it's showing us those interfaces that have been allocated to those non-default. Understand that if you are in a non-default virtual device context, like for instance here we are actually in the payroll context, when we do show VDC membership, and we're making configuration changes to various virtual device contexts, we can save all of those important configurations in one place, VDC1, saving them for all of our virtual device contexts. Now, as promised, let's wrap up this nugget with actually a concept you already know. We just didn't put it in these terms. It's called network interface virtualization. And what this refers to is our fabric extension technology, right? We have our Nexus 5K, and it is doing what we call end of rack switching for us. And then we have up at the top of the rack, or TOR, we have the Nexus 2K. We refer to this, of course, as we've talked about, as fabric extension. Well, think about it. There needs to be a virtualization of the port here, right? We have a logical port on the 5K that needs to translate really important to you, especially if you're in a 7K, 5K environment and you want to do virtualization inside your device. We know virtual device contexts literally create virtual devices inside of a physical device, and we know that network interface virtualization is a key to the 5K utilizing a 2K down out there as a remote line card. We know network interface virtualization utilizes a VN tag so that those logical and physical interfaces can be bound together. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.